There came a moment in my life when I finally understood what it means to be still and know that I am God. Until that point, I had spent my years chasing, striving, acting, pushing all in the hope that something outside me would change, that some force would deliver to me the life I desired. But it was only when I ceased acting and turned within that I discovered the true secret. Creation is finished, and I am already all that I have ever desired to be. I did not lift a single hand to make millions, yet wealth unfolded itself to me as naturally as the sun rises. You see, I had been taught that success requires effort, that money must be earned by sweat and struggle. But the teachings of truth revealed something far deeper, that the outer world is only the reflection of an inner state, and that the invisible imaginal act is the only action required. I remember the day it all began. I had reached a place of complete exhaustion physically, mentally, and emotionally. Every plan I made fell apart, every effort seemed to dissolve into dust. I felt as though life had turned its back on me. But that breakdown was the beginning of my awakening, for when I had exhausted all outer effort, I was left with no choice but to look inward. And there, in the silence of my imagination, I met the only power that truly creates my own awareness of being. I sat one night in quiet meditation. My heart was heavy, but something within whispered, "Stop trying, just be." And in that moment I asked myself, what would it feel like if I were already a multimillionaire? I did not think about the how. I did not plan a business. I simply felt. I imagined myself holding a bank statement in my hands showing millions. I felt the weight of that paper. I felt the thrill of abundance in my chest. I imagined hearing myself say, "I am free. I can do anything I desire." I fell asleep in that feeling. Not hoping but knowing, I assumed the consciousness of wealth before it ever appeared. I woke up the next morning unchanged outwardly, but inwardly I was transformed. Something had shifted in my sense of self. I no longer saw myself as someone struggling to become rich. I saw myself as one who was already rich, only waiting for the outer reflection to catch up. Days passed, and I continued this silent practice. I did not act, I did not seek. I simply remembered who I was. Whenever the old thoughts of lack appeared, I would quietly return to that inner knowing I am a multimillionaire, not as a wish, not as an affirmation repeated for hope, but as a statement of being. For what you claim within yourself becomes your reality. Then something strange began to happen. Opportunities, coincidences, and people began to move as if orchestrated by an invisible hand. A friend I hadn't spoken to in years called me out of the blue to discuss an idea he had. A dormant investment suddenly gained value. Money began to flow in ways I could not have planned. But the most extraordinary part was this. I did nothing to make it happen. The outer world simply rearranged itself to reflect the new state I was occupying inwardly. You see, there is no such thing as an inactive imagination. The world you live in is your imagination pushed out. Every circumstance you encounter is but the shadow of an inner assumption. The world mirrors your consciousness perfectly. If you dwell in lack, it will show you poverty. If you dwell in abundance, it will show you wealth. I learned that to manifest without action does not mean to sit idly in laziness. It means to act in imagination, to become inwardly the person who already possesses what you desire. This inner assumption is the only action that matters. Physical effort without the correct consciousness is wasted motion. But inner conviction, held in faith, moves mountains. Neville once said, "You do not attract what you want. You attract what you are." And that single truth became the foundation of my manifestation. I stopped wanting millions, for wanting only confirms lack. I began being a millionaire in consciousness. I no longer said, "I will be wealthy." I declared, "I am wealthy now." I recall one evening, while walking through the city, I deliberately imagined that everything I saw, the tall buildings, the shops, the lights, belonged to me, not in arrogance, but in awareness. I felt that the whole world was a reflection of my inner wealth. I walked as though every step I took was the step of a rich man. That walk of imagination became my prayer. And prayer, when properly understood, is not begging, it is the art of assumption. One night as I drifted to sleep, I imagined myself giving generously to others, helping families, supporting causes I believed in. I felt the joy of giving, not as someone who hoped to one day be able to give, but as one who already could. That night I fell asleep fulfilled, and that feeling persisted into the waking world. Within weeks, a long, forgotten payment from an old project surfaced. It was not millions yet, but it was proof that imagination was setting the scene. As I persisted in this inner wealth, the world around me began to bend. A business opportunity arrived that seemed effortless, as though designed by divine intelligence. A friend introduced me to an investor who, without much convincing, offered partnership in a venture that turned out to be extraordinarily profitable. But again, I did nothing to make it happen. I had only done one thing, assumed the feeling of wealth within myself. There were moments of doubt, of course. Old thoughts of fear and limitation would rise. But instead of fighting them, I learned to replace them. When my mind whispered, "It's not happening," I would gently respond, "It has already happened." When it said, "You don't have the money," I replied, "In my world, I already possess it." Slowly, that inner dialogue became automatic. I no longer had to convince myself, I simply knew. And then, one morning, it happened. I woke up to an email that changed my life. The investment I had made years before, the one I had completely forgotten about, had multiplied beyond imagination. Overnight, I became a millionaire. But by that time, the outer event felt almost secondary. I had already become rich in consciousness long before the world reflected it. This is the great secret of manifestation. The outer world is delayed reflection. The feeling you hold now is the seed of tomorrow's experience. When you know something within, reality must conform to that knowing. The law never fails. It may not unfold in the way your reason expects, but it will always fulfill the assumption you persist in. People often ask, if no action is needed, then what do I do? The answer is simple: you imagine. You feel, you assume, you occupy the state of your desire. That is the true action. The invisible act of assumption is the only creative act in this universe. The outer actions will come later, but they will arise effortlessly, without strain or calculation. I realized that I had spent my life believing in effort when I should have been believing in identity. For it is not what you do that changes your world, but who you are being while you do it. When you shift your inner being, the outer world reshapes to match that state. The millions came not because I worked harder, but because I finally became the person to whom millions naturally belong. There is a vast difference between doing to become and being, because you already are. The first keeps you trapped in endless effort. The second opens the floodgates of creation. To manifest millions without action is to recognize that everything already exists within consciousness. You are not creating money, you are selecting the version of yourself that already possesses it. When I finally understood this, all struggle ceased. I realized that I had never been waiting for wealth. Wealth had been waiting for me to assume it. Every desire is a calling from a state already existing within you. The moment you feel it as real, you have entered it, and the outer world must reflect it. I used to think action meant movement, calls, meetings, planning, striving. But true action is inner movement. It is the movement of consciousness from lack to fulfillment, from desire to possession. That is the only action that matters. All else is shadow play. One night I sat quietly and said aloud, "I am now the embodiment of infinite abundance." I did not repeat it mechanically. I let the words sink in until they became truth. I imagined the peace that wealth brings, not the excitement of sudden riches, but the calm knowing that all is provided. That stillness became my reality. And from that stillness, all things began to flow. When you understand that imagination creates reality, you cease striving to manipulate the outer world. You no longer chase, because you know that the cause is within. You rest in the knowing that the state you occupy will express itself without fail. You can sit quietly, do nothing, and yet the universe moves on your behalf. That is what happened to me. The millions came, and they came naturally. Not by hard work, not by luck, but by law. I had changed my inner conversation, and therefore the outer world had no choice but to mirror it. The law of assumption is infallible. It is always working, whether you are aware of it or not. If you believe you must struggle for money, then struggle you shall have. If you believe wealth is yours by divine right, it will flow to you effortlessly. I did not need to attract money. Attraction implies separation. I simply remembered my true identity as the source of all creation. The wealth I desired was already within me, waiting to be recognized. I was not manifesting millions, I was manifesting myself as the one who has millions. And so it is with every desire. Whether it is love, health, or success, the secret is the same. Stop searching and start assuming. Stop asking and start being. For as long as you ask, you confess that you do not yet have. But when you feel that you already are, the world must echo your inner conviction. The beauty of this truth is its simplicity. You need not move a muscle. You only need to move in imagination. Sit quietly, close your eyes, and feel the reality of your desire as though it were already yours. See yourself living the life you wish to live. Hear the sounds, feel the sensations, and rest in that feeling until it feels natural. That is the creative act. When you open your eyes, do not look for signs. Simply carry that feeling with you. Walk as though it were true. Think, speak, and feel from that state. And soon, the outer world will catch up, not because you forced it, but because it must obey the inner law. Looking back, I realized that the wealth I manifested was never about money alone. It was about awakening to the truth of who I am. The millions were only symbols, reflections of my inner abundance. I had finally remembered that I am the operant power. That imagination is God in action, that all things exist now. And so, to those who ask, can one really manifest millions without action? I say yes, absolutely. But only if you understand that imagination is the action. You are not creating by doing, you are creating by being. The moment you assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, creation is complete. The rest is simply the outpicturing of your state. My journey from lack to abundance was not a journey of miles, but of consciousness. I did not go anywhere, yet everything changed. The wealth I once chased began to chase me. The opportunities I once begged for began to seek me out. For when you dwell in the consciousness of abundance, you become magnetic to it. Now, each morning, I wake not to chase, but to give thanks. I remind myself that I am the cause, not the effect. I live in the awareness that all creation begins and ends in imagination. And as I remain faithful to that truth, life continues to unfold in ways beyond comprehension, effortlessly, perfectly, divinely. If you truly grasp this, you will never struggle again. You will know that every desire is already fulfilled the moment it is conceived. You will stop trying to make things happen and instead rest in the knowing that they already have. The only task is to feel it real and persist in that feeling. And so, I manifested millions without any action because the real action took place within. I shifted my state, I assumed the feeling of wealth, I believed in my imagination more than in the evidence of my senses, and the world, as it always does, conformed to the inner image. Creation is finished. All you must do is choose which version of yourself you wish to express. Choose wealth, choose abundance, choose fulfillment not as a dream, but as your present reality. Declare within yourself, I am already all that I desire to be, and watch as life rearranges itself to prove you right. For the truth is eternal. You need not act to become. You need only be. I remember vividly the night when the whole truth finally descended upon me, not as an idea, but as an experience. It was a still evening. The world outside my window was quiet, and I sat with nothing but my thoughts. For years I had believed that success was something I must earn, that wealth would come as a result of endless doing. But that night I dropped all effort. I became utterly still. I surrendered every notion of control, every strategy, every desire to manipulate circumstances. As I sat in that quiet, I felt a gentle shift in awareness. It was as though I could sense a deeper reality beneath the noise of life, a vast, silent field of infinite potential. In that stillness, I felt the presence of God, not as something external, but as my own consciousness. I realized that this awareness, this I am, is the source of all creation. I no longer had to reach for anything, because everything was already contained within that I am. I began to test this truth in the simplest of ways. I imagined myself as already wealthy. I didn't merely say the words. I felt it in every cell of my being. I imagined walking through my home knowing that every bill was paid, every account overflowing. I imagined the ease of generosity, the peace that comes when money is no longer a concern. I heard the inner conversations of those congratulating me, felt the texture of fine fabrics, the comfort of financial freedom. I let these sensations soak into me until they felt as natural as breathing. Each time I practiced this, I could feel a subtle but undeniable power moving within me. It wasn't excitement or anxiety, it was calm knowing. I began to realize that the imagination, when felt as real, is the womb of all creation. What I assumed inwardly began to echo outwardly, slowly at first, then with greater and greater speed. The truth is, most people are imagining unconsciously. They imagine failure, limitation, or fear, and the world mirrors it perfectly. I had done the same for years. My constant thoughts of lack had only created more lack. My worrying about money was not solving the problem, it was feeding it. So when I reversed this inner pattern, when I began imagining wealth and ease instead, everything began to change. I remember how the old part of me resisted. That rational, doubting voice kept saying, "You can't just sit here and imagine money. You need to do something." But each time I heard that voice, I smiled and answered, "Imagination is doing." For imagination is the only creative action there is. The physical world is merely the shadow of that inner act. There was one particular night when this truth became unshakably real to me. I was lying in bed, drifting into sleep, when I began to imagine myself in a luxurious home. I didn't visualize it from a distance. I placed myself right there in the scene. I felt the marble floor beneath my feet. I ran my hands along the smooth surface of a polished table. I looked out through enormous glass windows and saw the city lights sparkling below. I breathed in that atmosphere of accomplishment and comfort. It was so vivid, so tangible, that I could feel my body respond. My heart slowed, my mind quieted, and I felt completely at peace. When I woke the next morning, I carried that feeling into the day. I didn't question how such a life could appear. I simply knew it already existed in the unseen realm of imagination. Days later, a sequence of events began. Unexpected calls, opportunities, people stepping forward in ways that aligned perfectly with that inner scene. It was as if the universe had been waiting for my inner declaration before moving. I didn't have to lift a finger in effort, because everything came about naturally. The world around me simply rearranged itself to match the new state I was dwelling in. It wasn't forced or dramatic. It was graceful, inevitable. I realized that the law of assumption operates with mathematical precision. When you occupy a state in imagination, all of creation conspires to bring it into form. One of the greatest illusions we live under is that we must earn what we desire. The truth is, we only need to embody it. The world outside is but a mirror. What we hold within must reflect without. So when I stopped seeing myself as one who lacked money and began to see myself as wealth itself, the mirror changed. I remember when a friend asked me, "But surely you took some kind of action." I smiled and said, "Yes, but not the kind you think." My action was inner movement. I acted in consciousness. I moved from the state of wanting to the state of having. That was my only effort. And yet that invisible act accomplished more than years of labor could have. Another evening, I sat in silence and asked myself, what would I do if I were already a multimillionaire? Instantly, my imagination answered. I saw myself traveling with ease, not to escape, but to experience. I saw myself giving freely to others, supporting art, uplifting those in need. I could feel the sense of freedom that comes when money is no longer an issue. That inner vision filled me with warmth and gratitude. I realized gratitude is the language of completion. When you feel thankful for something, you are affirming its reality. You do not thank for what you hope will happen. You thank for what already is. And so, I began to live in that gratitude daily. I would wake each morning and silently say, "Thank you, Father, that I am already rich, that every need is met, that abundance flows to me without effort." And each time I did, life reflected that inner prayer in beautiful ways. Unexpected deposits, gifts, opportunities, all arrived as if called by my gratitude. But it wasn't about the money itself. It was about alignment. My inner world had shifted, and the outer world was simply mirroring that inner order. You see, the universe has no resistance. It only reflects. It does not decide whether you are worthy of wealth. It simply shows you what you assume yourself to be. I had assumed poverty for so long that the universe had no choice but to display it. When I changed the assumption, the reflection followed. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the outer world still appeared unchanged. In those times, I reminded myself, this is just the echo of an old assumption. I knew that persistence would crystallize the new reality. Faith is not blind belief. It is loyalty to the unseen vision despite the evidence of the senses. Every night before sleep, I practiced the same act. I would enter the scene that implied my wish was already fulfilled. Sometimes it was as simple as hearing someone say, "Congratulations on your success." Other times, I would imagine checking my account and seeing 7 figures. The exact picture didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling of completion. I would drift off with that feeling, knowing that the subconscious mind would take it and make it real. And indeed it did. Within months, wealth began to accumulate in ways that defied logic. People came into my life at the right moments. Projects that had once been stagnant came alive. Old debts were repaid unexpectedly. It was as though an invisible current was carrying me effortlessly toward abundance. That is when I truly understood what Neville meant when he said, "The world is yourself pushed out." The world had changed because I had changed. It was never about convincing anyone or forcing anything. It was about being faithful to the inner reality until the outer conformed. I noticed something else as this new life unfolded. When I was living in the consciousness of wealth, my mind naturally became generous. I no longer feared spending because I knew I was source, not subject. I gave freely, and what I gave returned multiplied. That giving was not a technique. It was the natural expression of abundance. I began to see wealth everywhere. I saw it in nature, in the sunlight, in laughter, in creativity. Everything was alive with the energy of abundance. I realized that true riches are not measured in numbers, but in consciousness. The millions I manifested were simply symbols of that inner richness. Still, the outer results were undeniable. The investments I had once written off began to bear fruit. Business ventures expanded. Income streams appeared from directions I couldn't have planned. But all of it was effortless because I had not created it through strain. I had allowed it through alignment. When people hear without any action, they often misunderstand. They think it means doing nothing at all, but it really means doing the right thing, the inner thing. For the imagination is the workshop of God. When you act there, the outer world must comply. Physical action is only the final stage of the imaginal act, not its cause. At times, I would simply sit quietly and listen. I would listen as if I were hearing the voice of God within me saying, "All that you seek, you already are." And each time I heard it, peace would wash over me. I no longer desired, I knew, and that knowing is creation. It was through this understanding that I discovered the real meaning of rest. Rest does not mean inactivity. It means inner assurance. It means knowing that the creative act is done, and therefore there is nothing to strive for. That is why I could say truthfully, I manifested millions without any action. Because once the state was assumed, there was nothing more to do. When you live from this place, life becomes magical. You no longer struggle because you realize that every event is the outpicturing of your own inner state. You stop blaming others. You stop chasing results. You live in harmony with the divine flow. I began to test this law in other areas too. I imagined perfect health, harmonious relationships, and success in every form, and the same law produced results each time. The outer world always bends to the inner assumption. There is no exception. What struck me most was the consistency of the law. Whether I imagined a small sum of money or millions, the process was the same. The only variable was my faith in the reality of the assumption. When I believed completely, the result came swiftly. When I doubted, it delayed, but even then, persistence brought it forth. I realized that all delays were self-imposed. The universe was not withholding anything from me. I was withholding it from myself by failing to believe. Once I removed that inner resistance, everything flowed. This understanding changed my entire outlook on life. I no longer saw money as something scarce or external. I saw it as an expression of consciousness, and consciousness is infinite. There can be no lack unless I assume lack. I began to live each day as the already fulfilled version of myself. I spoke from that state, thought from that state, walked from that state. Even when appearances contradicted it, I remained loyal to the inner reality. That loyalty was faith, and faith, when sustained, always produces fact. I discovered that I could remain completely still outwardly, and yet accomplish miracles inwardly. The imagination is a silent power. It moves unseen, yet it shapes worlds. The outer world merely reflects what has already been decreed within. The greatest freedom is realizing that nothing is truly external to you. Everything, every event, every person, every opportunity is drawn into your experience by your state of consciousness. Once you know this, you are no longer a victim of circumstances, you are the author of them. I often sat quietly and said to myself, everything in my world now expresses wealth, ease, and abundance. I didn't need to see proof first. I declared it, and that declaration was enough. I felt it as true, and soon the evidence appeared. I remember one morning waking up and realizing that I had become the embodiment of everything I had imagined. The world looked the same, yet it was different because my inner eye had changed. Everywhere I looked, I saw a reflection of my abundance. And it was then that I understood the sacred words, before Abraham was, I am. The I am within me had always been the creator. The millions I manifested were simply the shadow of that eternal being recognizing itself as abundance. Once you grasp this, you can never again live in fear or limitation. You know that you hold the key to all creation within your own imagination. You can sit quietly, assume the state of your desire, and the world must obey. That is the law, that is the truth behind my story, and the same power that manifested millions for me is within you, waiting only for recognition. As I continued to live from the state of wealth, I noticed something subtle but profound. My relationship with life itself began to change. I no longer looked at money as a goal to chase, but as a reflection of who I had become in consciousness. The desperation that once filled my thoughts was gone. I did not wake up wondering how or when things would happen. Instead, I woke up already fulfilled. I lived in the end, and the end lived in me. There is an energy, a vibration, that comes from certainty. It is silent yet magnetic. When you truly know something within, it begins to pull everything necessary for its realization toward you. That knowing became the current I lived in. Wherever I went, people responded differently. Situations unfolded smoother. What once seemed difficult became effortless, all because my state had changed. I began to notice how the law operated in the smallest details. One afternoon, I needed to handle a financial issue that would have worried the old me. But instead of reacting with fear, I silently declared, everything is already taken care of. I imagined the relief of it being resolved. Within hours, the issue dissolved without struggle. It was as if an invisible intelligence was rearranging the outer world to maintain harmony with my assumption. That experience confirmed to me that consciousness is the only reality. There is no power outside of imagination. Every condition of life is the expression of an inner cause. When that cause changes, the effect must follow. I had lived for years thinking I was bound by circumstances, unaware that I was the one creating them all along. But once I assumed the consciousness of wealth, it was impossible to return to the old idea of limitation. Even in moments of quiet, when I sat doing nothing, I could feel the pulse of abundance surrounding me. It was as though I had tapped into a living stream of creation that was constantly flowing through me, expressing itself as ideas, opportunities, and ease. I realized that this flow had always been present. I had simply been blocking it with beliefs of lack and struggle. Once those beliefs dissolved, the flow revealed itself. There was a day when I received a call from an associate I had not spoken to in years. He mentioned a business opportunity that perfectly matched my current interests. It was so aligned, so precisely timed, that I knew it was a direct result of my inner assumption. The outer world was reflecting the inner conviction that wealth was my natural state. I entered that venture not from a place of need, but from joy, from the quiet confidence that everything I touched was blessed. The results were beyond logic. The project succeeded faster than expected, returns multiplied, and my finances reached levels I once thought impossible. But what struck me most was the effortlessness of it all. I did not plan it, chase it, or force it. It appeared naturally, like fruit growing on a tree that has already been planted. The seed was my imagination. The tree was my state of consciousness. In those moments, I often recalled Neville's words. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled and continue feeling it until that which you feel objectifies itself. I had done exactly that. I had persisted in the inner act until the outer world had no choice but to conform. I understood then that doing nothing, in the physical sense, is not laziness, it is supreme faith. It is resting in the awareness that all is already done. There were times when the senses tried to deceive me, when appearances still showed lack. But I learned not to fight those appearances. Instead, I reminded myself, this too is imagination, and I can imagine differently. Every time I felt doubt rise, I replaced it with the inner declaration, I am already rich. Slowly, those doubts lost their power, and the new belief took complete hold. I began to walk through the world differently. I carried myself as someone who had everything. My conversations changed, my choices changed. Even the way I breathed felt different, calm, steady, assured. I wasn't trying to become wealthy. I was simply expressing who I already was in imagination. That state radiated from me without effort, and life responded in kind. I realized that action is only ever the shadow of inner conviction. When the inner state is right, any action you take will naturally be the correct one. You do not have to plan it, force it, or analyze it. It will arise spontaneously, guided by intuition. That is why my external non-action still resulted in perfect action through others, through events, through timing I could never have orchestrated myself. I would often spend evenings in quiet imagination, not visualizing money, but feeling peace, the kind of peace that comes from total sufficiency. I imagined myself enjoying life, giving freely, traveling, living abundantly. The feeling was always more important than the picture. The subconscious does not understand words, it responds to feeling. When the feeling becomes natural, the subconscious accepts it as truth, and the outer world reorganizes to match. Soon, wealth began showing up in forms I never expected. Unexpected payments, gifts, ideas, opportunities, they all flowed in. The more I relaxed, the faster it came. I began to laugh at how simple it all was. For years I had labored and strived, thinking that effort was the price of success. Now I understood that rest is the price of realization. The moment you rest in the feeling of the wish fulfilled, the work is done. I often share this truth with others, and they ask, but how can I stop acting? Don't we need to do something? And I tell them, you are always acting, but the stage is within. The imagination is the only stage that matters. Every outer deed is born there. You can sit perfectly still outwardly, and yet be performing the greatest creative act inwardly. The world you see tomorrow is the result of the role you play in imagination tonight. The more I lived from this awareness, the more I saw the perfection of every experience. Even the struggles of my past began to make sense. They had been the very resistance needed to awaken me to this truth. Without those challenges, I would never have looked within. Every difficulty was a blessing in disguise, pushing me to remember my true power. As months passed, I became increasingly sensitive to the subtle shifts of consciousness. I could feel when I was in alignment and when I was not. Whenever I sensed tension or worry, I would pause, close my eyes, and return to the inner feeling of wealth. I would imagine myself surrounded by abundance, calm, and fulfillment. Within minutes, that energy would return, and soon after, the outer world would mirror the shift. One of the most beautiful aspects of this practice is that it removes all sense of competition. You no longer compare yourself to others, because you realize there is no scarcity. Every person is creating their own world through their own assumptions. You don't take from anyone by becoming wealthy. You only draw from the infinite source within yourself. There is no need for envy, fear, or guilt. There is only creation. I began to notice how my imagination had become automatic. Where once I used to worry about bills, I now imagined abundance naturally. The feeling of wealth had become my home. And because it was now my dwelling place, everything that entered my life reflected that dwelling. I didn't have to think about manifestation had become my nature. Even when I faced moments of uncertainty, I no longer reacted as before. I would say to myself, this too is imagination unfolding. I have already chosen the outcome. That simple awareness kept me stable, and every challenge soon dissolved. The outer world cannot persist in a state you no longer believe in. There came a point when wealth itself stopped being the focus. The millions I had manifested were there, but what truly mattered was the understanding that I was the cause of it all. That realization is worth more than any sum of money. For once you know that consciousness creates reality, you possess the key to everything. I found great joy in using this awareness to bless others. When friends struggled, I would silently imagine them thriving. I would hear them telling me good news, feel their relief, see their happiness. Without saying a word, changes began to occur in their lives. They would call me days later, saying things had turned around, unaware that my imagination had gone before them. That was proof enough that imagination is not bound by time or distance. Each night, I returned to that sacred practice, the stillness before sleep, the assumption of fulfillment, the feeling of gratitude. It became as natural as breathing. My imagination was no longer a tool. It was my way of being. I lived in constant dialogue with the unseen. Every desire that arose was simply another aspect of myself asking to be recognized. Even my perception of money changed. It no longer felt like something separate, something to gain or lose. It was simply energy, fluid, abundant, and infinite. I knew that as long as I remained aware of myself as source, that flow could never end. The outer symbols might change, but the consciousness that produces them remains eternal. I began to see that wealth, like everything else, is a mirror. It reflects yourself, concept. When you feel unworthy, the mirror shows lack. When you feel worthy, it shows plenty. The mirror never lies, but it also never judges. It simply reflects what you are being. And so, I made it my only task to be what I desired to see. Many people believe they need motivation to achieve success. I learned that true power lies not in motivation, but in realization. When you realize who you are, the imagination of God, all striving ends. You no longer need to be inspired to act, because creation happens through being, not through doing. I often found myself smiling at how the simplest imaginal act could produce the most magnificent results. One afternoon, I imagined receiving a message of good news, a sign of greater abundance. That very evening, I received confirmation of another profitable venture. It was so natural, so seamless, that it felt ordinary, yet I knew it was the law in operation. Everything became effortless because I was no longer divided in mind. I wasn't trying to force one belief while secretly feeling another. I was wholly identified with the state of abundance. That unity of mind is what the ancients called faith. When heart and imagination move in harmony, the world bends to that frequency. Sometimes I would sit in quiet awe at how perfectly life responds to the imagination. The precision with which it arranges events, the timing, the synchronicities all reveal an intelligence far beyond the human mind. Yet that intelligence is not external. It is the deeper self working through imagination. Even now, when I recall the early days of my transformation, I marvel at how simple it all was. Nothing outside me changed first. Everything began within. The moment I stopped struggling and assumed the feeling of wealth, the tide turned. It was as though reality had been waiting for my recognition all along. The truth is, there is no distance between imagination and reality. They are one and the same, one seen, the other unseen. When you imagine something and feel it as real, you are not creating it, you are unveiling it. You are shifting awareness to a version of yourself that already exists. This understanding freed me completely. I no longer feared losing anything, because I knew that everything exists eternally in consciousness. If something seems to leave, it only means I have shifted states, and if I wish to experience it again, I have only to return to that state in imagination. I realized that every manifestation follows the same pattern: desire, assumption, fulfillment. The desire itself is evidence that its fulfillment already exists. You could not desire what is not possible. The moment you feel the desire, you are being called to occupy that new state. And when you answer that call by feeling it real, the manifestation must follow. As this awareness deepened, I found peace that surpasses understanding. I no longer looked to the world for confirmation. My faith was inward. The millions I manifested were no longer symbols of success, but reminders of truth, that consciousness is the only cause, that imagination is creation itself, that effort is unnecessary when you know. And now, as I bring this journey to a close, I want you to understand something far greater than the idea of wealth itself. What I have shared with you was never truly about money, it was about mastery. The millions I manifested were only symbols, reflections of the inner transformation that took place when I accepted the truth that consciousness creates reality. I did not chase the outer. I became the inner cause. I did not run after opportunity. I embodied the state from which opportunity must come. When I understood that the entire universe bends to the self concept I hold within, I stopped acting as though I were powerless, and I began being the source. The truth is simple yet profound. You were never meant to do to become, you were meant to be, and allow the doing to arise naturally. Everything external is but the echo of your internal assumption. When you see yourself as rich in imagination, the world must show you wealth. When you see yourself as chosen, life must mirror back opportunities that affirm that choice. It is law, unbroken and unchanging, that whatever you assume with faith will harden into fact. So let this message awaken something deep within you. You no longer need to look outside for validation, for approval, or for evidence. You need only look within and feel the truth of your desire as already accomplished. Live from that end. Think from that state. Rest in the knowing that it is already yours. The outer world has no choice but to bow to the image impressed upon your inner world. You are not a beggar before fate. You are the dreamer giving order to the dream. Millions came to me not because I worked harder or chased endlessly, but because I surrendered completely to the identity of I am wealthy. That was all. That single assumption restructured my world, reorganized people, places, and events, and brought me into alignment with abundance that had always been mine. What you believe yourself to be is the only power at work in your reality. Believe you are lack, and you will see lack. Believe you are wealth, and wealth will rise to greet you. So tonight, dare to claim what is already yours. Dare to stop striving and start being. Walk in the feeling of the wish, fulfilled, and let the world rearrange itself around your new conception. Do not wonder how it will happen, wonder only what it feels like now that it has. Let imagination lead and watch as life follows. For the truth that changed my destiny will change yours too. There is no effort in divine creation, only assumption. I manifested millions without any action because I learned the secret that all action begins and ends within the mind of the one who imagines. The moment you accept yourself as the one who already has, creation is finished. The world in time merely reveals what you have already decreed in the silence of your consciousness. So I ask you, will you keep waiting for proof, or will you finally become the proof? Will you continue searching for the path, or will you realize that the path appears the instant you know who walks it? Everything you desire is already alive within you. You need only awaken to it. The power is yours, it always has been. And when you dare to claim it, when you dare to say with conviction, I am, the universe itself must answer, so it is.